Hello and welcome to Rippercast, your podcast on Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders. This is Episode 1, Sudden Death, Robert Donston Stephenson. Originally released on February 8, 2008, and featuring Howard Brown from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who at the time was the proprietor of the JTR Forums message boards, and Mike Covell, a researcher based out of Hull in the UK. I often see people remark as to why this true crime podcast begins its first episode with a suspect show on Stephenson, when typically true crime podcasts begin a series of episodes at the beginning of the case. The truth of the matter is that when I first started suggesting in late 2007 that Ripperologists record a podcast, very few people knew what a podcast was. There were no true crime podcasts in existence at the time. I know it's crazy to think about it now, but it's true. I've been told that this episode and this podcast is the first. My idea was simply to gather a group of Ripperologists and researchers who posted on the message boards together and record them chatting with one another about various aspects of the case. Since most were ignorant of what I meant by podcast, and even some were unfamiliar with the technology involved in recording what was essentially an international conference call, the first who jumped on board immediately became the episode's first participants and regular guests going forward through the initial run of episodes. Howard Brown, Mike Covell, and Robert McLaughlin were three of those few first people to show interest in this project early on, which led to the initial episodes focusing on their areas of expertise. Hence episode 1 being about Robert Donston Stephenson, which Howard Brown was an expert on. So, and the audience we were recording this for at the time were just our fellow Ripper researchers. I had no thoughts of gaining an audience wider than that. So I didn't care about editing the show. I didn't particularly care if the sound wasn't perfect. And we didn't check our language or the content in any way so that people new to the case would understand what was going on and what we were talking about. The conversations were amongst experts and intended to be listened to by experts. So that'll give you a little background on why these first few episodes aren't at all what one would expect today from a true crime podcast. But anyway, here is episode 1 in all its messy glory.
I'm Jonathan Mangus. Also with us from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is Howard Brown, author, researcher, and proprietor of the website jtrforums.com. Hi, Howard.
How you doing, John?
I'm doing
Glad to be here.
Thank you. And joining us from the city of Hull in the UK is researcher and author Mike Covell. Hello, Mike.
Hello.
Now, towards the end of the show, we'll share our views on other items of interest to Ripperologists. But for now, it's sudden death. Robert Donston Stephenson. Howard, as briefly as you can, for those who either don't know or need a refresher course, who was Robert Donston Stephenson?
Robert Donston Stephenson was born in Hull, April 20th, 1841. During his life, he made many, many claims. He wrote newspaper articles for the Pall Mall Gazette, and he was the author of a book in 1904 called The Patristic Gospels. During Stephenson's life, there are several instances that have been claimed by leading authors like Melvin Harris and Ivor Edwards, which simply don't pan out, but they are worth examining. In 1888, Robert Donston Stephenson entered the London hospital with a case of neurasthenia and was released on December 7th, 1888. And subsequently, he had a conversation with a retired ironmonger named George Marsh. On December 24th of 1888, George Marsh took samples of his handwriting to the Inspector Thomas Roots at Scotland Yard and revealed his his belief that Stephenson may, in fact, be the Ripper. 2 days later, on Boxing Day, Stephenson appeared at Scotland Yard and disclosed his views that Dr. Morgan Davies of the same London hospital was, in fact, the Ripper. As a result of the meeting of Stephenson and Roots, it appears that Stephenson was cleared because of Roots' prior knowledge of Stephenson. In the 20th century, theory about Stephenson being the Ripper emanated from Aleister Crowley, the famed necromancer and black magician, all the way to the 1930s with Bernard O'Donnell, a Fleet Street reporter, who in 1958 put together a manuscript which we call the O'Donnell manuscript, but it was actually entitled "This Man Was Jack the Ripper." It was never published. It's available on jtrforums.com for public viewing. Stevenson's modern candidacy within the last 20 years, since the centennial of 1988, has been primarily led by the late Melvin Harris and currently Ivor Edwards with his book Black Magic Rituals, which is found on Blake Publishing. Their belief in Stephenson as a bona fide suspect is basically reinforced by the views of Victoria Kremers, a woman who had at one time been a business partner with Robert Donston Stephenson, and Mabel Collins, the famous theosophist in the early 1890s. Mike, would you like to add anything to this?
Pretty much covered all his life there.
Well,
throughout his life.
He wasn't the first person to posit the notion that a black magician could be responsible for the murders.
No, he wasn't. Arthur Diocese in October of 1888 more or less scooped Donston with that revelation.
And there was also letters to the newspapers at the time suggesting, and this I find interesting, suggesting that the police use spiritualists and use occultists in an attempt to apprehend Jack the Ripper.
Absolutely.
And then Robert Donston Stephenson comes forward and is maybe the second, the most prominent figure, let's say, to posit the notion that the murders were actually committed by a black magician.
Correct.
And then the tables turned on Stephenson shortly thereafter.
Right.
With Stead himself accusing Donston of being the Ripper, correct?
Well, that's true, but one has to remember when W.T. Stead said that in 1896 in the preface to the story that Stephenson submitted to Borderland, which Stead was the publisher of after he left the Pall Mall Gazette. Stead is known for saying that for a while there, for a year, he thought that Stephenson was the veritable Ripper. The problem with that is that W.T. Stead's own letters that he obviously wrote to Stephenson while Stephenson was in the Curry ward at London Hospital were the letters that George Marsh had seen and revealed to Inspector Roots on December 24th, 1888. So Stead knew that Stephenson was in the hospital at the time. And to me, that's incontrovertible evidence that Stead was just making a joke or a tongue-in-cheek remark about Stephenson being the veritable Ripper. For instance, Stephenson wrote two more articles in January and February of 1889 for Stead while he was in the Pall Mall Gazette. If Stead had believed that he was the veritable Jack the Ripper, why did he allow those two articles to be published? What do you have to say to that, Mike?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously at the time, if Stead had thought he was the Ripper, why not come forward and say so? I mean, if his newspaper is the first to publish that, it's got to be the scoop of the century rather than letting this guy produce, all these stories. I can only describe them as fiction coming from Stephenson.
Correct. And you're talking about a man, Stead, who actually went to prison for his involvement with a kidnapping scheme to reveal the issue of child labor and child prostitution.
Yeah.
John?
Yes, right.
Okay.
The Maiden Tribute of Babylon is what the article in which Stead was imprisoned for procuring. Now, there's a current debate on Stead's motives in that case, but that's for another show, I'm sure. But the issue of black magic in the Jack the Ripper murders, we have Lees, who
Robert J. Lees,
right? Who shortly after the Ripper murders, there were articles that some people believed referred to him in using his powers of clairvoyance to capture the Ripper. Later came the story of Dr. Stanley, who has a similar twist on it, and these two stories predated Creamer's and Crowley, and then O'Donnell's relationship with Creamer's. Now, Howard and Mike, how do you take the Victoria Creamer's story and stick it into this whole this whole cabal of black magicians being responsible for the murders?
Okay, I'll go first, Mike.
Okay.
All right, Victoria Creamer's came back in 1890 and hooked up with Mabel Collins again. They were friends in Southsea, and for a period of about 2 years, this trio eventually put together the Pompadour Cosmetic Company, of which Stephenson was said to have been the one to put together the chemical composition of the product and all that. But during this time, Stephenson, according to Creamer's, did a few things that were sort of suspicious, and eventually the relationship between Collins and Stephenson dissipated to the point where Mabel Collins allegedly told Creamer's that she thought he was Jack the Ripper. Creamer's did some investigation on her own. She ostensibly went into this black deed box and found some bloody cravats. She went into a trunk of his and found some letters. And what's very curious about all this is that you have a woman, Victoria Creamer's, telling Bernard O'Donnell in the 1920s or 1930 to be exact, that she was actually living with someone that she felt was Jack the Ripper. She took Jack the Ripper's word that he would not kill anymore. There would be only 5 victims. She also lent money to Jack the Ripper, and then after she moves away, she lets Jack the Ripper, a.k.a. Stephenson, know where she lives so he can come to her house and borrow money. It's pretty implausible, and it really stretches the imagination to buy into this.
Right.
What I think,
and Creamer's knew Aleister Crowley, was friends with Aleister.
She was a secretary for Crowley, exactly.
And Crowley had claimed to actually be in possession of this box of blood-soaked ties.
Yeah, well, then we have to.
And O'Donnell was a friend of Crowley's.
Exactly.
But yet, O'Donnell never claims to have seen from Crowley.
Neither did Betty May.
Neither did Betty May.
Exactly. And not to interrupt you, John or Mike, what I had been talking to Mike about previously is that it's entirely possible that this whole story about the bloody ties emanated from Crowley, because we don't have any documentation that Creamer's actually sent to Mr. O'Donnell, who unfortunately is deceased. And we're only going on the hearsay of what Mr. O'Donnell says that Creamer's told him. But the fact of the matter, the first time that we ever hear about these bloody ties and that anyone owning them was Crowley. Certainly Crowley would have showed them to someone, but he's not known to have done that.
Not even to O'Donnell, who...
No, absolutely not. They were intimates of each other.
Apparently, on the entire subject.
Right, exactly.
As well as I was mentioning earlier to Howard with regards to, Crowley introducing the story of the blooded ties. I mean, Crowley at this time was marketing himself as some sort of big black magician himself. Having a story like that would certainly back up the fact that this guy was trying to put himself across as being this big black magician. You know, and as well with if Creamers knew that he was Jack the Ripper, if I found that out, I'd be straight out of there. Yeah. I wouldn't be living with the guy and giving him my address, and certainly not lending him money.
Absolutely. And another thing, I don't mean to interrupt you, Mike or John, but it needs to be said that for 38 years after the initial meeting of Mabel Collins and Stephenson, there is not one scrap of paper or one note ever written by Mabel Collins discussing Stephenson or the fact that she, quote, lived with Jack the Ripper, unquote. She never makes any mention of him. There are no writings from Victoria Kremers, and the O'Donnell manuscript was never published. And I think one reason is that it's entirely possible that the O'Donnell manuscript is a fiction born in the mind of Bernard O'Donnell. And a lot of it came from Crowley. And it was a good fiction story. But there are so many holes in it, and there's so many implausible parts of that story. If anyone has ever taken the time to read it, that it's not simply a matter of one lady being irritated at Stephenson for standing in the way of a relationship with Collins, because Collins and Kremers were allegedly very intimate. And
Howard, so you're suggesting that the O'Donnell manuscript was composed as a fraud?
Well, actually, it was never published. So it was
never published, but it was seen by Richard Whittington Egan. It
Correct.
was seen by Stephen Knight. It was read by Melvin Harris.
Correct.
It was read probably by, I don't know for sure, but Robin Odell suggests that he may have read this manuscript.
I know several ripperologists who have had this thing for a decade and a half.
It made the rounds. I mean, if the man was attempting to perpetrate a hoax, what would have prevented him or any one of these, Egan, Knight, Harris, Odell, et cetera, from commenting on his findings? I mean, did they take it as the joke that it may have been, or
they may have? They may have, but one of them certainly did, and that's Melvin Harris. Melvin Harris uses the Kremers memoirs to support the third book in his trilogy of Ripper books. This Man Was Jack the Ripper, The True Face of Jack the Ripper, which came out in 1994. I'd like to add something else on here for people that have read things that I've written before on JTR forums and in Casebook. There are actually two means, motives, and opportunities to Donston being a modern suspect. The first was in the 1988 or 89 book called The Ripper File by Melvin Harris, where Mr. Harris says on page 168 that after the Kelly murder, Stephenson was too ill to continue his murders, and he entered the London hospital. Now, at that time, Mr. Harris did not have the actual date that Stephenson went into the hospital, which was July 26th of 1888, and he left on December 7th. But in the interim between that book and the third book, The True Face of Jack the Ripper, he had found the actual time, the actual dates that he was in, and what the reason was, because he does not mention that in the Ripper File. And then in the third book, The True Face of Jack the Ripper, he puts forth this theory of fake neurasthenia, something he did not do in the previous book. And we still are dealing with that and contending with that today, whether or not he faked neurasthenia. And I don't think that he faked anything at all, because within a calendar year, Stephenson was in the hospital for 204 days. That doesn't sound like he was faking it to me.
And Melvin Harris is in the process of writing his books, systematically attempted to debunk every suspect that had been mentioned before Robert Donston Stephenson, and then he did a good job of it, I must admit. So when he gets to Stephenson, I mean, he, as his suspect, he just all of a sudden says, this person didn't do it, this person didn't do it, this person didn't do it, but the Loch Ness Monster did it. Or, or something to that effect. Don't you agree?
Exactly. I've been calling it a hoax for about a year now. And if either of you saw the recent program, it was, recent meaning in the last 7 months, Is It Real? It was a documentary on television, and it featured Ivor Edwards. And Ivor went to the London hospital, and he discussed Stephenson as an occultist, Satanist, and a doctor. And Stephenson, as far as we know, was neither of those things. He was none of them. He wasn't an occultist. Anyone reading about black magic does not necessarily practice it. And Stephenson did write about it, but he also wrote about religion, and he wasn't a minister. He wasn't a doctor because there are no diplomas. And if he had attempted to be a doctor, he certainly made a poor effort of it. One thing that led me to really re-examine the whole Stephenson story was the 1871 census. By that time, Stephenson had claimed that he had already had a medical degree for 10 years. But if you look at the 1871 census, he declares himself as a lieutenant in Her Majesty's Coast Guard. And in 1881, he calls himself a doctor, but not in practice. Mr. Harris claims in the True Face that Stephenson had a diploma emanating from New York. And he probably got that from the Roots report, because Inspector Roots mentions Stephenson boasting of having a diploma from New York. Well, an American diploma at that time would not have been accepted in Britain. If Stephenson did come over to America, he just wasted his time, because he comes back to Britain and he doesn't practice medicine. It really makes no sense for a man to have two diplomas but not to practice. What do you think about that, Mike?
It's a waste of time and money. Applying for all that and travelling all that distance to come back and not do anything with it. Recently, when I was in Islington, I had a look for all the trade directories, and as a practising doctor or not practising doctor, surely he'd have had his name in there to drum up business. Nothing. Not one mention of Rosalind Stephenson, Robert Donston Stephen, Robert Stephenson. Nothing whatsoever. I looked for all the medical entries for around about covering a period of about 20 years, and there was not one mention of this guy as an MD, as an author, having any kind of business. There was nothing under the alphabetical surname listing. There was nothing under the addresses. There was nothing under any of the professions that is listed mentioning this guy's name. Now, surely, if he wanted to drum up business for himself, he'd have put his name in there and made a bit of money from it, but nothing whatsoever.
And money and finance is a key theme to the Stephenson story, because it's very hard to pin down where he got his money from. One of the things I wanted to mention to Mike was the Borderland article in 1896 where Stephenson, this is one of the most famous bones of contention in the whole Stephenson story. In the first two paragraphs of that article, we noticed that Stephenson declares that he met Lytton when he was 22 years old, which would have had to be in 1863. But as we both know, all three of us know, that he was working in Customs House. He began working there in April 25th of 1863, and his job was terminated in December 31st of 1868. There is no proof that he ever met Lytton in the first place. We do know that he plagiarized Lytton when he used a segment of his Borderland article, which can be found in The Coming of the Great Race by Lord Lytton in 1836. And I believe Canadian ripperologist Mark Franzoy found that. Some of the other elements of the Borderland story have been disproven, especially the part where Stephenson talks about going to Africa and killing a witch doctor named Subay with a talisman that he acquired from Lord Lytton. Well, an Australian ripperologist named Graham Wilson discovered that no Englishman had set foot into that region of the Cameroon until 1875. So Stephenson certainly didn't go to Africa either. And most of Stevenson's writings were carbon copies of what H. Rider Haggard and whatever author of the time was in vogue.
Now, Stephenson also claimed to have fought with Garibaldi, and that is also something that Madame Blavatsky had claimed to do. And
Correct.
I know that they both were acquainted. Now, is there...
excuse me, John. It's alleged they are acquaintances. That's another bone of contention. There is no proof that Blavatsky knew Stephenson.
Well, I thought there was an incident where she was reading some kind of newspaper that mentioned black magic and Jack the Ripper, and she had some familiarity with that. So she was reading the Pall Mall Gazette article.
I believe that she thought that was the Earl of Crawford. Am I right about that, Mike?
That's right. Yeah, it appears in the O'Donnell manuscript. I think Cremer's walks into the room and sees Blavatsky sat there reading this article, and they're all quite excited, and she goes over.
They thought it was the Earl of Crawford, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and here, subsequently, Cremer's discovered that it was Stephenson that wrote the December 1st article in the Pall Mall Gazette. It's called One Who Thinks He Knows. But as far as Blavatsky's service to Garibaldi, if this 5-foot-tall, 250-pound woman had served for Garibaldi, I believe that she is alleged to have served with him in 1867. Stephenson at that time was in his 5th year in his sinecure at the Customs House in Hull. So it's quite possible that those two never met or traveled in the same social circles. For example, when Collins urged Stephenson to write this story called African Magic in 1891 or 1890, I'll be corrected here. It was Collins who approached Blavatsky, not Stephenson, because Stephenson had not been introduced to her.
And Blavatsky's assistant at the time was Cremer's who?
Collins. Collins was the right-hand woman for Blavatsky up until they had a dissolution in their relationship.
Right.
And Collins was getting a little too popular.
So is there any evidence at all that Stephenson served?
Well, Mike?
The only thing that we've come across recently, I believe it was Andy Aliff that found this, was the muster rolls held at the Bishopgates Institute, which were compiled by George
Jacob
London,
right, Mike?
That's correct, yeah. It was basically George Holyoake was in charge of the recruitment of the British volunteers. One of the names in the muster rolls was a Robert Donston Stephenson, age 22. I mean, this was in 1863, this entry. His height's given as 5'10", and his address is given as Skullcoats, Hull, but then it's altered and it reads 4 River Terrace, North Islington. Now, a muster roll, I'm not sure, I'm not military inclined, but as far as I'm aware, a muster roll is just something that the volunteers go and give the name. It doesn't necessarily mean they go to fight. This falls right in between the period of time when it was at Hull Customs House. It's Mike, a bit of a puzzle.
Pardon me 1 second, Mike. Did you say 1863?
1863, the entry was left in a book of muster rolls. Okay.
All right. The issue with that is if his name is in that muster roll, then it had to happen in either January, February, or March, because in April 25th, 1863 is when Stephenson definitely was in Customs House, and we have that from Andy Aliff, the same Andy Aliff.
Yeah.
So there's an issue right there.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Okay.
So let's fast forward to 1888. And where Stephenson is in the London hospital in the East End. He claims to have witnessed his doctor, Dr. Davies, giving a demonstration of the Jack the Ripper murders, the murder of Mary Kelly, I believe, in which Donston claims that because the press had reported that no one's ever discovered yet, but that semen was found in Mary Kelly. The description of the act that the Dr. Davies performed in front of, apparently Mike has discovered, at least nine other patients in the same ward. Stephenson goes and writes a letter to the police about that.
Correct. Yes, he said he did that in front of Dr. Evans, a fellow patient, and that there were 5 other medical personnel in the same room when Dr. Davies was describing the, how would you say, the rear entry of the victim. And anyway, this is what he discloses when he goes to talk to Inspector Roots on December 26, Boxing Day, 1888. And allegedly, this is the reasoning behind his bizarre behavior of trying to finger Dr. Davies as Jack the Ripper. And in fact, he makes no bones about it. I mean, he goes to the police and divulges what he thinks are the sound reasons for the police to investigate Dr. Davies.
Right, and no evidence has been found that the police actually ever investigated Dr. Davies. Is that correct?
No, not at all.
I actually went through the meeting minutes which cover 1888 and 1889 from the Royal London Hospital. These cover patients, finances going in, finances coming out, etc. They also cover all the doctors and surgeons and what they're up to, if anyone's complained, if any of the patients have lodged a complaint, and nothing was lodged against Davis. There's no records of any police coming into the hospital and asking him his whereabouts on any of the dates of the murders whatsoever.
All right, now there's been some question as to whether Stephenson would have been able to leave the hospital in order to commit these murders and then return. Maybe Howard can talk about that theory, and then Mike can address what he's discovered in his recent research.
In the study of Stephenson, one is led to believe that Stephenson would have had free access to the front door at any time of the day or night. Now, what's unusual about this, rather striking about it, is that at no time do we ever hear about Stephenson going to meet Stead. In fact, rather that he receives letters from him in the hospital, in the Curry ward. And these are the same letters that I mentioned before that George Marsh refers to Inspector Roots on December 26. I'm not intimately familiar with the goings-on at the London Hospital, but I know Mike is. Perhaps Mike would like to carry on now.
Yeah, I mean, basically, both Curry ward and Davis ward were both situated on the third floor. At night, the external gates were locked, and the only way in or out was through the lodge, which was at the front. Now, the gatekeeper who held the key, obviously, emergencies in or out, and staff in or out. So there's no way whatsoever he could have got through there. Being on the third floor as well obviously poses problems in getting down to the ground floor without being seen. I do know that Curry ward was a ward with roughly about 20 beds in. So again, people would have been there to see him coming in or going out. Now, there's been this, could he have jumped over the gates? Well, first of all, the gates stand at around 7 or 8 foot. I took some photos recently. I stood next to them, and there were double massars, and there was no way whatsoever. Well, I say I'm quite fit, but there's no way I could jump over those. Now, what we have to remember is that Stephenson still had some gunshot lodged in his leg, so surely that would have affected his physical ability in jumping over that gate.
Right.
But the information's there in the yearbooks 1888 and 1889. There's also a fantastic book which charts the history of the Royal London Hospital, which does show you maps. The maps are of the ground floor, but it does say right in that both Curry and Davis were situated on the third floor to the rear of the hospital. So it'd have been a major problem getting out and getting back in again without being seen.
Excellent.
And now, but Melvin Harris, his theory was not that Stephenson escaped from the London Hospital to commit the murders and then return, because he never actually had Stephenson in the London Hospital for the duration of the killings. Is that correct?
That's the first book in the Ripper file, which came out in late 1988, which was it ran at the same time as the secret identity of Jack the Ripper, the Centennial Program, around that time, 88 or 89. In that book, on page 168, Mr. Harris claims, and his rationalization is that Stephenson was simply too physically debilitated to commit any more murders. And then after the Kelly murder on November 9th, he goes into the hospital. Well, that's not true. He had already been in the hospital for 3.5 months prior to the Kelly murder.
Right.
But then, as I said before about a half hour ago, in the period of time in the interim between 1988 and 1994, Mr. Harris must have gotten his hands on the London Hospital register, and he realized his mistake, that Stephenson had been in a hospital even before the Tabram murder, which is not considered a canonical murder or one of the McNaughton Five. But in any event, he had been in a hospital before August. So it presented a very big problem for him, and the problem was solved by him coming up with a fake neurasthenia claim. You don't see Mr. Harris claiming any such thing in May of 1889 when Stephenson again goes into the hospital, and this time they put down chloral hydrate. Is that right, Mike?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, he was
when you're looking at the London hospital patient registries, there's actually a little bit of explanation as to what a lot of the sections mean. Now, basically, when Stephenson went into the hospital, he went in on his own accord, and this is established in the register under a referral section which is left blank. If that's been filled in by someone, it means that you've been sent there by someone. So he's basically gone because he's feeling ill.
Yeah.
It was at the hospital without the approval of the hospital governor. And again, there's a small heading which says with or without ticket, and he didn't have a ticket. To gain admittance to the hospital, you had to go through a pre-admission meeting, and this was for everybody. Now, it was in there, so he must have gone through that. It must have been seen by someone at the hospital who thought that this condition was genuine. Now, basically, looking at the yearbooks for 1888 and 1889, it does say there is a small list in there that mentions that they don't want patients to stay in there over, I think it was 30 days, unless it's serious. It was in there a hell of a lot longer.
He stayed there 134, 4.5 times that long.
And this was an indigent ward, is that correct? Where the only patients that were admitted were the ones that could not claim residence elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, basically what they did was, if they didn't think that it was serious enough, they'd send you off to a workhouse where you could basically get cared for, but not to the high standards that the hospital was offering at the time. And afterwards as well, they'd do reviews on you after these 30-day periods, and if they thought that you was well, you'd be released. Or the other alternative was they'd send you off to these care homes like the ones that you see in Brighton. And again, you'd get a level of care, but not to the same degree that you'd get in the hospital. And for some reason, Stephenson's condition was so serious that he was kept there for that length of time.
Right.
And he had no fixed permanent address at this time, is that right?
No, he didn't. He had lived in Brighton up until a period of at least 1 month before July 26, 1888. We know that he was there. We don't know exactly what day that he left. That remains to be seen. Mike and I both think that he may have tried to live with his brother Richard Stephenson in Islington. Isn't that correct,
yeah,
Mike?
That's right, yeah. Richard moved to Islington around about the same time that Robert Donston Stephenson married Annie Stephenson. Another interesting aspect is that when Robert Donston Stephenson was living in Islington after 1888, 1889, it was just round the corner from the church. Prior to that, just after the wedding, when Annie and Robert Donston Stephenson moved to Islington, they were living round the corner from the church where they got married, and it was about 20 minutes walk away from where his brother was living. And his brother lived in the same place all the time, up until later in his life when he moved out of Gibson Square.
And this was the wife that Melvin Harris claimed he had beheaded, is that right?
Yes, in a Ripper file, yeah, he does mention, in the True Face of Jack the Ripper, he mentions beheading. I think that's just one of the typical embellishments when reading that book. Mr. Harris writes a very colorful story about Stevenson. He's even prepared a 10-point guideline for the serial killer, which practically every man that I ever met could fill. It says a lot about me, I know, but it's so generic that anyone could fit it, and it's just an attempt to foist this guy into the public. Stevenson, as a suspect, was finished on December 26, 1888. That's my view. But the contemporary attempt to make Stevenson a suspect is a real mystery, and it's especially a mystery in light of the fact that Mr. Harris was a professional investigator that worked for the BBC, for Arthur Clarke, the inventor of the satellite, the communication satellite. And it's very strange that someone would simply drop all caution and accept this guy as a viable suspect. In the subsequent years, Stevenson is ranked fairly high as a suspect. There have been some pretty prominent devotees of the Stevenson cause. I know that Mike and I both felt that Stevenson had the bona fides to be a good suspect until we really examined the whole story. And we found so many flaws, and so many intentional flaws, declarations are simply sourceless, and that's the big problem with Stevenson, is the source.
Right? And
am I right, Mike?
That's right. Yeah.
Back to it. Yeah, we'll touch on why you guys are Reformed Stevensonites here in a second. But what really happened to his wife?
What happened to his wife? Well, I know that it was lightly touched upon in the True Face of Jack the Ripper by Mr. Harris that he may have disposed of her. And then in the 2002 book, The Black Magic Rituals by Ivor Edwards, Ivor theorizes that the alleged murder of his wife, the torso that was found in the Regent's Canal, which is one of the umpteen residences that Stevenson has under his belt, he theorized that may have been a milk run, that he may have killed his wife. To me, it would be just like saying that his wife left him and swam the English Channel to France. I mean, there's no proof that he ever had any acts of violence in his life. In fact, my wife, Nina Brown, found a newspaper article about the demise of Anne Stevenson. She retained her name. She was born in Thorn. She was the same age, and she had the same profession. She died in a domestic accident. She died of coal gas inhalation. And that's one of the little facts and details that have been surfacing over the last 3 or 4 years that people haven't really talked about. They've tried to sweep that under the rug because, number one, Stevenson is a draw. Black magic, occult, sinister, living inside of a hospital and running right back into a hospital after committing these murders. He draws people into the case, and that's a good thing. That's good for newbies, but for people that are serious scholars of Ripperology, people with a purist approach to it, and they really want to study this case, they're going to take all the facts that Mike and I have been bringing up, and some other people too, and they're going to examine them, digest them, and they're going to see, I think, as Mike and I do, that he's not only a non-suspect, we have to question why he was ever presented in the first place. Mike?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Annie Stevenson's there for all to see after this body appeared. I think people have just latched onto that as if they want to make him their suspect, that's the way to go, by saying that he did this act to this unfortunate. But if that's the case, if it was a milk run, why were none of the C5 found with their heads chopped off?
Right.
It just makes no sense whatsoever.
No, it doesn't. It never did.
But you must admit that the candidacy of Stevenson as a Ripper suspect has some coincidences, in that he was a man who was the first to present black magic as a possible motive for the murder, save Diolsi. And then he goes and accuses Dr. Davies.
Correct.
George Marsh turns around and accuses Stevenson in 1888. Fast forward 20 years. And you have another group of people in the black magic milieu, being Crowley, Kremers, et al., who turn around and suspect the exact same man who, in whether they knew it or not, in 1888 was in fact put forward as a suspect in the Jack the Ripper murder.
Okay, but there's a different, John, those are good points. There's a different basis for why Marsh believed that Stephenson was the Ripper. His belief in Stephenson being the Ripper was his demonstration in the Prince Albert Inn. Stephenson had just gotten out of the hospital, and he had not had any alcohol for a long time. He simply may have said too much. Marsh may have believed in what he said because, well, we know what he believed in what he said because he took samples of his handwriting and he presented it to the police, but he did not mention anything about the black magic or the black arts. As you said, that 20 years later on, we find Crowley and Kremers. Well, actually, it's not Kremers. We have to take this with a grain of salt. Kremers, we have no actual writing from her. We have no documentation she ever wrote anything, and the fact that she had known Stephenson may have been something, as Mike intimated before, something that Crowley picked up on and embellished, because we know Crowley throughout his career was a great prevaricator. And I think that Mike has touched on a very good point there, that Crowley could have used Kremers' alliance with Stephenson back in 1890, in 1891 and early 1892, and taken some of the snippets of information that Kremers gave to Crowley and fabricated this whole story about the black ties. Now, it's...
you meant Kremers' association with Stephenson and
Kremers' association with Stephenson, correct, right. And Collins. Right. And we once again we have nothing documented that Collins ever said anything about Jack the Ripper in any of her writings, in any of her books. And she lived for 30-something years afterwards, and not one word.
And I was playing devil's advocate in that last question, as you may know.
Sure. Oh, it's good to discuss Donston. It's sort of like my favorite topic. I like Stephenson a lot.
And I know I've read a lot of Crowley, and I completely and totally agree with you on his art of embellishment, because, I mean, he's a notorious liar.
Exactly.
So he very well could have been the source for all of this.
Right, exactly. And because of his unusual relationship with O'Donnell, because O'Donnell had been sued by Crowley. And Mr. O'Donnell was a Fleet Street reporter, a crime reporter. He wrote several books.
Now, he was sued at a later date. Is that correct?
Yes. Hayter Preston is the person. Hayter Preston was a gentleman that worked on Fleet Street, and he was the person that allegedly told Mr. O'Donnell that he should talk to this lady that worked for Crowley, which presents another problem, because if Crowley and O'Donnell had known each other, then I'm sure that Crowley may have said something to O'Donnell, about these ties before, or excluding Kremers altogether. It just seems to be a convenient piece of fiction, that's all. And to me, that's the reason why it was never produced. But then again, that's just my opinion.
Why the Box of Ties was never produced?
The Box of Ties?
Or the O'Donnell manuscript.
Both of them. I don't believe in the Box of Ties story at all. It simply makes no sense that Stephenson would keep these souvenirs of these bloody cravats. Even if Stephenson did have ties, there's no guarantee that was blood. And once again, we don't know if Kremers actually said any of this.
Right. Now, Kremers could have just alluded to cravats. And,
yes.
And that would have sparked Crowley's imagination to just take that.
Exactly. And he had a vivid imagination.
I agree. He did. All right. So you brought it up, Howard. So Stephenson was at one time your main suspect in these murders, as
absolutely
he was Mike's.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, let's start with Mike. What started you down the Stephenson path, and what changed you around?
First and foremost, with him being a local, and being born and living just down the road from where we live. I'd always heard rumours that supposedly Jack the Ripper was from Hull. There were rumours that he was a doctor, that he was involved in the black arts, and it seemed like a logical place to start is to look local and expand from there. The final nail in the coffin for me, in sort of saying that it wasn't, was going to London Hospital and looking at the transcripts myself and seeing that there's no way he could have got out and done these things that, you know, people have been putting forward all these years. It was as good as locked up, nice and safe and warm in there. There's no way whatsoever he could have got. It was in a unique position in terms of that he probably read about the case and discussed it with those that were on the ward with him. But as far as his involvement goes, you know, it pretty much ends there, other than the letters that he sent and being accused himself and accusing someone. There was no way whatsoever that he could have gone and committed him.
Yeah.
No way.
Mike, excuse me, not to interrupt you. Let me ask you this. Do you see that the Whitechapel murders were a convenient way, or actually like a blessing for Stephenson? They actually provided him a way of getting out of the hospital.
Provided him with a meal ticket, you know, right into the newspapers, and it was a sort of subsidised, or even provided him with an income. And then in later years, you know, if these people are talking about him being Jack the Ripper, he's obviously, you know, loving being the centre of attention, and, you know, he was in a unique position, and I think it helped him a great deal.
Now, Howard, about your interest in Stephenson as a suspect, how did that start out, and what swayed your opinion of him as a viable suspect?
Well, my interest in Stephenson as a suspect began probably around year 2002 when I read some things on Casebook, the great website www.casebook.org. I read some work by Melvin Harris and more importantly by Ivor Edwards, especially his distance theory, that the murders were committed 930 to 950 yards apart. And to me, it seems really coincidental that could happen. But then again, that whether for good or bad, that's what started me down the road into believing Stephenson may have been the Ripper.
Eliminating Mary Kelly as a victim.
Well, actually, no. I at that time, and for the most part, I still do think that the Ripper committed that murder, but that wasn't part of the pattern. I know that one doesn't fit into the 930, 950 yard pattern. But the first four from Nichols all the way through Eddowes, I believed it could have been a pattern. So the more I read about it, and the more I read the work of Mr. Edwards and Mr. Harris, I took it with a grain of salt that these sources were verifiable. And in studying it, I realized that virtually nothing is verifiable. Almost all of the sources, if they come from Stephenson, they have to be taken with a lot of salt. And some of the claims by the authors just don't pan out for whatever reason. And the more I looked into it, and then the more I looked into it, it looked fishy. And as a result, I bought the second book, The Ripper File, and when I saw on page 168 the claim that Stephenson had entered the hospital after the Kelly murder, to me, it clinched it. That this was the reason why in the third book, The True Face of Jack the Ripper, that Mr. Harris put in he unveiled the premise that Stephenson faked neurasthenia when he hadn't done so the first time. And by presenting the fake neurasthenia, he's providing the means of Stephenson going out at night, which of course Mike has proven now that he couldn't have. He was going out at night and using the London hospital as some sort of bolt hole, and then going back in. He only had to go out on 4 occasions, if you believe in the canonical 5, and being Jack the Ripper. And to me, the greatest mystery of this is not necessarily that Stephenson could be a suspect, but is why he was made a suspect in 1988. That to me is the biggest mystery of all.
Right, and you have a map on your wall of the locations of the Jack the Ripper murders.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I want to read to you real quickly a very short letter to the editor of the Daily Telegraph, dated October 2nd. Sir, in examining the chart representing the locality of the Whitechapel murders, published in your issue of today, it is curious to observe that the lines drawn through the spots where the murders were committed assume the exact form of a dagger, the hilt and blade of which passed through the scenes of the 6th, 2nd, 1st, and 3rd murders, the extremities of the guard making the 4th and 5th. Further, the spot where the portion of the apron belonging to the victim of the Meter Square tragedy was picked up lies in the imaginary line which forms the hilt of the dagger. Can this possibly afford a clue to the position of the next atrocity? I am, sir, your obedient servant, Observer, from London, October 2nd. Now, there's a curious letter that ends up forming the basis of the Stephenson theory, is it not?
That's one of the three major Stephenson theories. Mr. O'Donnell had one too. He has patterns in the O'Donnell manuscript. Mr. Harris doesn't make any claims about any pattern, I don't believe. Mr. Edwards does. He has a theory that they represent the Vesica Pisces. But Arthur Diocese, I believe, scooped. I think I mentioned that before. Arthur Diocese wrote to the newspapers in October about the possibility of black magic being involved in the murders. I believe it was a Chapman murder. Am I right, Mike?
That's right. It
was a Chapman murder with
So,
matches. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I can look at the layout too, and I can see a parallelogram. And I don't think I've never heard of anybody claiming that a crazy mathematician created these murders. And I'm not trying to be facetious, but I guess anyone could see anything they want in the layout. But just for the sake of honesty, that's the reason why I got involved with Stephenson in the first place. Much to some people's chagrin, I'm sure.
That the locations of the victims' bodies formed some kind of symbol, and he was premeditating not necessarily the victims or the status of the victims, female low-class prostitutes, as so much as the location of the victims.
Right.
And that has its repercussions to this day, where there is still ongoing debate whether such and such was a casual prostitute, whether
Catherine is correct.
Could have been considered hooking, for lack of a better term, on the night she was murdered, and that I find interesting, but at the same time incredibly unlikely. I mean that the murderer would scout out the locations of his killings based on some kind of preconceived two triangles forming a cross.
Right, exactly. Let me just add this before I forget, John. This is not the only time that a pattern has ever been determined to appear in a series of murders. Anyone familiar with the Zodiac killer case that happened in the United States? Someone took an acetate and put it over a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, and they found that these murders occurred apart from each other on a 57-degree radian angle. And it's not also the first time. It's not the only time. It's not the only time that someone has ever been considered to be a killer that would seek refuge in a hospital. The Cleveland Torso murders in the 1930s featured a suspect that Elliot Ness believed it was Jack the Ripper. The Cleveland Torso killer that would seek refuge in the state mental institution.
Right, and wrote threatening letters to the police from.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a precedent for the modern Stephenson theory as Stephenson being someone who writes letters, which he obviously did, which he obviously lived in a London hospital, and which he obviously made a comment about a pattern appearing in the December 1st issue of the Pall Mall Gazette, as I previously mentioned.
Right. And but correct me if I'm wrong. Some of those. There's a couple of Zodiac killings, and we're talking about the Zodiac killer up in San Francisco,
correct,
in the 1960s, that did not quite match that pattern that was drawing. There was a few exceptions, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah, you'd have to ask Tom Voigt. He's the expert on the Zodiac killer. I'm trying to get Tom Voigt to participate in the 5 questions forum on JTR forums, but I'm going to ask him about that. I appreciate you mentioning.
Mary Kelly is excluded as a Stephenson victim because she was killed indoors and and her murder location doesn't match up to the preconceived theory of the symbol that he was going for. Is that right?
Well, I think Mike will back me up on this. I believe Mr. Harris and Mr. Edwards both believe that Mary Kelly was the 5th victim and that there were only 5 victims, because what they're doing is they're parroting the line that Stephenson ostensibly told Kremers, that there would be only 5 victims. But then it's unusual, if you read the December 1st Pall Mall Gazette, Mike can back me up on this too, that Stephenson mentioned 6 victims.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure if he's including Martha Tabram. I'm not sure. I think he probably is.
Yeah, he includes Tabram.
Speaking of patterns, the Ipswich prostitute murders, which are the guy who's supposedly done these recent atrocities, is on trial at the moment in the UK. They're saying that the murder sites form a cross. And some of the guys were talking about that over on the Casebook website, that where the murders occurred, or at least where the bodies were found, form a cross. Taking into consideration as well that there were some other girls that went missing that were also local prostitutes, and these girls have never been found, but they also fall within the lines of this particular cross. It's pattern recognition. It's something that most people do.
Yeah, there are a lot of murders that probably form some kind of pattern if you looked for a pattern, or you came across it by accident. Wouldn't you agree, Mike?
I agree. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Robin Odell, in his book Ripperology, says that the precise locations of the murders were therefore of critical importance. This is according to the black magic motive of Stephenson. By including 2 murders not conventionally accepted as Ripper murders, and declining to include Mary Kelly because she was murdered indoors, the 6 killings that result form a cross. Harris wrote, quote, "The point of glory had to be reached by dominating and eliminating scarlet women at the moment of orgasmic release, blah, blah, blah. This in turn would unleash tremendous psychic injury." So is that... is Odell just quoting Harris's first book, and then apparently Harris did have a theory on Stephenson attempting to form some kind of cross symbol in the layout of the location of the victims' bodies.
Mike?
I think the idea was, in regards to a black magic approach, is that forming a cross with the victims would give the killer some sort of superior power. People have argued that it was invisibility, yeah, and if you wanna go down that road and believe that sort of thing,
No, I don't at all. It's just that I find it interesting that type of theory put forward by Harris, put forward by Donston, if you believe that his wording of the two triangles that across the tri-delta, however he signed his name on the from a man who thinks he knows, or whatever. It's interesting that to this day, people can be sucked in to the theory that the murderer was trying to form some kind of symbol on the ground.
That's the draw. That's the attraction. That's the attraction. It's far more attractive to have someone
in the London hospital. Did he have, did the guy have a map all worked out with the locations of the victims' bodies and skipped out on Kelly, which is the victim that he claimed Dr. Davies virtually confessed or simulated the murder of. I mean, it's all rather puzzling. But so you guys, why don't you give your final verdict on Donston as a suspect here, and give a summary of what you believe, and basically, say what last words on Stephenson.
Okay, Mike.
I think he was in a unique place at a unique time. I think that it was a great opportunity for him to become involved and make a little bit of money, and ultimately a meal ticket. But in terms of being the Ripper, no chance.
Howard?
Okay, I believe that Stephenson was a contemporary police suspect for 2 days, December 24th to December 26th, 1888. Everything after that is sourceless and is specious speculation. The only issue I have with Stephenson now is to figure out why Stephenson went under the radar and no one else picked up on the stuff that Mike and I have been picking up for the last 20 years. It's been accepted, and it's been accepted by authors like Evans and Begg, that he did practice black magic. Is Mr. Odell, Mr. Rumbelow, they all mention it in his books. Not that they believe in Stephenson, not that they believe he was Jack the Ripper, but the fact that it's been this constant, insistent, rhythmic perpetuation of these myths that he was an occultist, a black magician, a doctor, all these things. None of that stuff is proven. And none of that stuff will probably ever be proven into positive. Mike has shown evidence that he wasn't a doctor. The evidence is solidly in favor of the modern Donston theory as being a hoax, and the total amount of time that Stephenson was ever a contemporary police suspect in 1888 was 2 days. That's just my view on it. Right. I'd be willing to debate anyone anywhere at any time on Stephenson if they'd like to discuss Stephenson as even being a moderately viable suspect, but he's not. As Mike has proven that he couldn't have gotten out of that hospital.
No.
And so therefore everything else after that is dross. It's worthless. If he can't get out of the hospital, he's not a suspect. Of all the people in London in 1888, there's one guy that we know exactly where he was for 134 days, before and after the last accepted Ripper victim in 1888, and that's Stephenson. We know where he was, and why a professional investigator or another author with an accumulated 70 years of interest in Ripperology would foist this guy into the lap of Ripperology is beyond me. And that's my final word on it.
All right, and anyone who is listening to this podcast and would like to debate Howard Brown or Mike on this issue, because there are Melvin Harris is deceased, unfortunately, so he can't defend himself or his writings. Ivor Edwards, who has been mentioned in this broadcast, is a living being and is more than welcome to join this debate. And he conducts his own website in the UK that I'll provide a link to in the show notes. So I just want to make that clear that pro-Stephenson people are, of course, invited most definitely to talk about this further with Howard and Mike. Is that right, guys?
Absolutely.
Yep. No problem
Absolutely.
at all.
That's what Ripperology is all about. speculation is the lifeblood of ripperology. It's what we need to keep it going.
All right, let's get on to a few other things before we close this show out. Donston aside, the new issue of the Ripperologist published a photo of Joseph Levant, who is the witness who may have seen the victim Catherine Eddowes with Jack the Ripper moments before her death outside of Church Passage Meter Square. There's been some discussion as to whether photographs of witnesses, victims, dead or alive, suspects, etc., hold any bearing on this case. What are your guys' opinion on the discovery of photographs of the victims, suspects, witnesses, etc.?
All right. Well, I'll just say I think it's a wonderful thing to have a photograph of Joseph Lewend. It really doesn't. It doesn't really add to the accumulated knowledge that we have of the case, but it puts a human face on this witness, and he's an important witness, and he's also important in the fact that he says he couldn't recognize the person he saw in Mitre Square. Mike?
Yeah, I'm going to shock you all now by saying that I've not actually seen the photograph, but I've heard...
Go to my website, www.rippernet.com, and I have a very small reproduction of the cover of the next Ripperologist that shows his picture.
Yeah. I've read the fantastic reports coming in from all the guys that have been subscribing, and, they're all in awe. And it just goes to show that there is still stuff out there if you're willing to look for it.
Well,
you can find it.
And the way I look at it is that every human has a past, and every photograph tells a story. And this man is seated, looking. I mean, is an elderly gentleman sitting with his family, and that means something, to the case. As much as some would argue against it, this man's past. You see him surrounded by his family, and it is important to the case. And now, if a photograph were to surface of this gentleman wearing a red handkerchief with a crazy look in his eye, seated next to his wife, who has a black eye, then that, the people that argue against photographs...
You just made a new suspect, John.
Well, but you know what I'm getting at is that...
I know.
It's all in the eye of the beholder. What you want to take from the image that's presented to us and how it relates to the case,
It certainly is more important than having the theory that this French individual came up with, that Melvin McNaughton himself was Jack the Ripper. No, it's an important thing, like Mike intimated. And as you've been saying, it does put a human face on this man, and it also shows that there is other data out there available.
Right.
And that's great. What Ripperology needs, it depends on it.
Right, and it is a case of possibly looking into the eyes of the only man, hypothetically, who could have seen Jack the Ripper, and that's always important, in my opinion, anyway.
I think it's in our mutually held opinion. Well, I think all three of us agree with that, and I think the majority of people in Ripperology, you're going to have a few people that will dissent, and they don't see much value in having a photo of Lewende. Well, that's their opinion. I believe, as you two guys do, that it's an important find. It's good. It's really a positive thing.
Yep.
All right. The second thing I wanted to ask you guys, and Mike, I don't know if you'd be excluded from this question, but the U.S. Ripper Conference was announced to take place in Knoxville, Tennessee, this coming October. Are either of you attending?
Well, I had planned on going, but I believe what Nina and I are going to do is go to the UK conference in 2009 if they will allow my kind in England. Mike, you going to let me over there?
Yeah, sure, mate. You're welcome anytime.
Okay. You have a lot of beer in your refrigerator over there?
I don't drink, Howard, but we do have beer in the fridge.
Well, you're going to have to start drinking, aren't you? Okay. Now, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it, John. I understand that Rippercast is going to appear at the convention. That's a great thing. I think that's going to be a good thing for Ripperology.
I'm 90% sure that I'm going to be there. Now, would I have taken Niagara Falls over Knoxville, Tennessee? Absolutely. But because it's what do you do? It'll be my first Ripper conference, and I hope to be there. I'm planning on being there. I just need more details as far as hotel rooms, what the speakers lineup is going to be, and all that. But I do hope to be there, and I do hope to attend the UK conference in 2009 also. So
great. We'll have somebody to. We'll have somebody to. From the States over there besides Nina and myself. That's great.
If that's the only opportunity I would have to meet Howard Brown, then I'm going to definitely plan on being at the UK conference in 2009.
You better watch what you wish for, John.
Oh, well. I look forward to it.
Yeah, I look forward to it too.
Now, okay, the final thing I want to talk about before we wrap up is Robert Anderson's discovery of Kosminski being arrested, or ticketed, actually, I shouldn't have said arrested, for a failure to muzzle his dog in the city. And he was able to appear in front of the judge in 1889 and make a good presentation for himself. Wouldn't you guys agree?
I'm not quite as familiar with this story as I should be, but yeah, it does sound like he made a good presentation of himself. Mike?
Yeah, again, I looked briefly at the discussion, and it does seem that he presented himself quite well, which is going against the beliefs that have been put forward. One's got to sort of look at this in the light as well as, what sort of class was he in at the time, his social standing. I believe you said earlier that he was living with his relatives?
Correct.
I believe he was living with his brother.
Yeah.
Wolf Abrams, is that correct?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about it is that this time, Anderson and Swanson had him masturbating continuously, eating out of the gutter, etc., etc.
Yeah.
The prior year, so
right.
It kind of makes the case that and also the fact should be pointed out that he was arrested by the city police, and then. According to Anderson, later became a city suspect, right? And they were the ones who were watching his house. So that's an interesting bit of information. But Kosminski's demeanor in court, from what the very brief press articles were posted, show a man who was in his total senses, and not so much the crazy gutter dweller as the police officials Anderson and Swanson claimed at the time. So that's kind of an important find. Would you guys agree?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
I mean,
I'd like to see.
Yeah.
Not that we need any more information to eliminate Kosminski as a suspect, because honestly, I don't believe he was Jack the Ripper. But it's just adding further doubt on Anderson and Swanson's recollections. Now, whether they were wrong in tagging Aaron Kosminski this way, or whether researchers have been wrong in identifying Aaron Kosminski as the Kosminski, then I guess that's still up to debate. So.
I think that's fodder for another show, to be honest with you, John. What about you, Mike?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I think we should get some of the Kosminski people on this program.
Well, I hope to do that, and anyone who wants to be on the show can be on the show. As long as you have a Skype account and microphone on your computer, that's all it takes.
Information on how to get a Skype account is going to be on your website, correct? Rippercast.
Sure. I mean, anyone can Google Skype, and it's a free download.
Yeah. SKYPE.
SKYPE. And there will be show notes on the website, www.rippernet.com. Show notes for the podcast, which are any books that may have been mentioned, any websites that may... Whose child is that in the background? Is that yours, Mike?
Yeah,
it's not Mike's and mine. Mike and I are childless, aren't we, Mike?
No, that's Matt, who little one's come home.
Oh, wonderful. I sent my little one away for the podcast.
It's 7:30 over here now, so it's their bedtime.
Alrighty, well, I'll wrap this up and say that show notes for the podcast has links to all books, websites, individuals mentioned in this podcast are going to be available at www.rippernet.com in the podcast archive section of the site. And anyone is free to email comments, suggestions, and questions, and we'll address those on future podcasts at rippernet@mac.com. Are there any websites you guys would like to plug real quick? Or books coming out, Mike?
Well, obviously,
Casebook.
Facebook at jtrforums.com. jtrforums.co.uk. That's Mr. Edwards' website. The gentleman I'd like to discuss Donston with in the future debate. Those are the three off the top of my head. Right. English-speaking websites. The English-speaking websites, that is.
All right, and we all referenced books, and the links to those books on Amazon will also be included in the show notes. So that wraps up the first episode of Rippercast. Hope you all enjoyed it. And I hope you listen to it next time.
Yeah, see you later.
All right.
Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.